It started with a quiet evening at home, just the two of them, curled up on the couch with the low hum of a movie playing in the background. Chris noticed Samantha had barely touched her wine, and her fingers kept fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. That was the first sign. He knew her too well. Nervous hands always meant words were building behind her lips. "I need time to think," she said, eyes fixed on the flickering TV screen. Chris turned his head, heart dropping even before she finished the sentence. "About us?" he asked softly. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah. I don't know where I stand right now. It's not that I don't care. Everything feels blurry lately." He didn't respond immediately. He watched her, her profile outlined in the dim light, looking more like a stranger than the woman he had loved for nearly 4 years. Samantha had always been someone who needed room to breathe. But lately, she had been gasping for air that wasn't his. "I just need a little space," she added quickly, almost like she was afraid he'd say no. Chris studied her face. There was no anger there, no resentment, just confusion, restlessness, and something else. Perhaps guilt. He knew this moment had been coming. She had pulled away in small, almost imperceptible ways. The way she'd answer his calls with a delay. The nights she'd say she was too tired to talk. The growing quiet between their conversations. Still, hearing it said out loud felt like someone had pressed pause on his chest. "I can give you that," he said finally, "if that's what you need." Relief flooded her expression, but Chris caught the subtle flicker of discomfort too, like she was grateful but already slipping away. That night she slept in the guest room. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Samantha had asked for space, and Chris, ever the understanding one, ever the patient soul, had always promised he would never suffocate someone he loved. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm of polite distance. They still lived under the same roof, but their paths barely crossed. Samantha claimed she needed clarity. She'd go on long walks, sometimes return late from work, and occasionally disappear into her journal for hours. She wasn't cruel, she wasn't unkind, but she was absent in a way that made the air around her feel colder. Chris, meanwhile, wrestled with the silence. He replayed memories of better days. Lazy Sundays in bed, road trips filled with laughter, whispered dreams of shared futures. Now he wandered the same house feeling like a visitor. He respected her need for space. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet truth began to rise. She wasn't looking for clarity. She was drifting toward a decision she didn't want to admit. And Chris was starting to understand that giving her space might not bring her back. It might just be the beginning of letting her go. The days slipped by like pages torn from a calendar, quiet, weightless, and strangely hollow. Samantha moved through their shared space with a new kind of stillness. She wasn't angry. She wasn't outwardly cold. But she had become distant in a way that couldn't be explained by simple stress or a need for solitude. She was there, physically, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, the creak of her chair at the kitchen table. But her presence had become muted. It was like living beside a ghost of the woman Chris once knew. She no longer asked how his day was. The morning coffee she used to make for him with a sleepy smile now sat forgotten. Conversations, when they happened, were short, functional, and laced with a strange awkwardness that had never been there before. Chris didn't need her to declare what was wrong. Her silence told him everything. Each word she didn't say, every glance she avoided, felt like a slow unraveling of the bond they'd once shared. Chris tried to stay hopeful at first. He gave her room. He kept things light when they did speak, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the space would work. Maybe it would bring her back to him with clarity and renewed love. But the harder he tried to stay calm, the more the truth sank in. Samantha wasn't searching for answers. She was stalling. She didn't need space to think. She needed space to leave, and she just hadn't figured out how to say it yet. She began spending more time out of the house. At first, she claimed she was visiting friends or needing time to clear her head at the park. Chris didn't question her. He didn't want to be the man who clung or interrogated, who made her feel trapped. But every time she walked out the door, she took a piece of their relationship with her. and every return felt like less of a homecoming and more of a quiet intrusion. Nights were the worst. Chris would lie in their bed alone, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low murmur of music or television from the guest room where Samantha had chosen to sleep. He sometimes thought about knocking on her door, about asking her to talk, to just be honest with him. But he didn't, because he already knew what the answer would be, even if she didn't have the courage to say it aloud. His friends began to notice. A few asked if everything was okay. Chris brushed them off with half smiles and vague reassurances. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk. It was that he didn't know how to explain the feeling of loving someone who no longer met you halfway. How could he describe the loneliness of being in the same room with someone and still feeling completely alone? What hurt the most wasn't anger or betrayal. It was the slow, quiet erosion of intimacy. The way Samantha no longer laughed at his jokes. The way she turned her head away when he reached for her hand. The way her eyes didn't light up anymore when he walked into the room. It was as if all the little threads that had once bound them together were snapping, one by one, and neither of them had the strength or the will to tie them back together. Chris wasn't naive. He knew relationships went through rough patches. He understood that love, at times, needed time to breathe. But this was different. This wasn't a pause. It was a retreat, and he was no longer sure if she was coming back from it. One evening, as he stood in the kitchen washing dishes, he caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass window above the sink. She was standing in the hallway, watching him. But the moment their eyes met, she turned and walked away without a word. That moment, brief and silent, said more than any argument ever could. She wasn't uncertain anymore. She was just unwilling to face the truth of what she already knew. Her heart was no longer here. Chris dried his hands slowly and stood there, letting the silence fill the room. The kind of silence that doesn't just come from a lack of sound, but from a lack of connection. He realized he wasn't just waiting for her to figure things out anymore. He was waiting for himself to accept what he couldn't deny. This wasn't love on pause. It was love on life support. And he was the only one still trying to keep it breathing. The breaking point didn't come with a dramatic fight or a final straw. It arrived quietly, like most endings do. Not with a scream, but with a silence that became too loud to ignore. Chris sat alone in the living room on a rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind of gray, soft-spoken day they used to spend curled up under blankets watching old movies. Samantha had gone out hours ago without saying where. No explanation, no time of return, just a coat, keys, and the sound of the door closing behind her. Again. He no longer asked. He no longer expected an answer. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, but he didn't bother warming it. Instead, he stared at the ring of condensation on the table, letting his thoughts spiral. The truth had been circling him for weeks, but he'd held out hope like someone holding onto the last plank of a sunken ship, half believing rescue was still possible. But hope had become a burden. It was no longer keeping him afloat. It was dragging him under. That day, something shifted. Chris realized he'd spent too long waiting for her to come back emotionally, waiting for a conversation that would never come, waiting for the version of Samantha he used to know to reappear with love in her eyes and clarity in her words. But that woman was gone, or at least gone from this relationship. And what remained was a shell of a connection that required all of his energy to maintain, yet gave nothing in return. He wasn't angry. That surprised him. There was no resentment, no hunger for blame or bitter words. Just a quiet understanding that loving someone didn't always mean holding on. Sometimes real love meant knowing when to let go. Not because you wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive. That night he stood in the doorway of the guest room, watching Samantha as she scrolled through her phone, her face illuminated by its soft glow. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in whatever world she now preferred to theirs. When she finally looked up, there was no fear, no guilt, just exhaustion, like she was tired of pretending too. "I'm not angry," Chris said calmly, his voice firm but gentle. "I just can't do this anymore." She blinked, her fingers going still. "What do you mean?" "I mean the space you asked for. It's become a void, a distance that isn't helping you find clarity." It's helping you disappear. And I've been standing here, waiting for something that's not coming back." Samantha opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. Perhaps because deep down, she knew he was right. She had asked for time, but she had taken something far more precious: his peace, his sense of home, his emotional presence. And now she had nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in 1,000 ways through her detachment. Chris didn't wait for her response. He turned away not out of spite, but because he finally understood that no explanation could fill the gap she had created. Some things end not because of cruelty, but because the emotional weight becomes too heavy to carry alone. In the days that followed, Chris moved with purpose. He didn't slam doors or throw accusations. He simply began detaching, piece by piece, emotion by emotion. He packed a few essentials and moved into a short-term rental across town. He canceled their upcoming dinner reservations. He unsubscribed from the couple's newsletter they used to read together on Sundays. Small steps, but each one was a reclaiming of himself. Friends noticed the difference in his tone when he spoke. There was a new clarity, a steadiness. Not cold, but resolved. He didn't speak badly of Samantha. He didn't need to. People could feel the shift in him, like a man who had finally laid down a heavy burden. Letting go wasn't easy. It wasn't about forgetting her or erasing what they'd shared. It was about choosing himself after too long of waiting to be chosen. It was about recognizing that being endlessly patient wasn't strength if it meant you were slowly bleeding out emotionally. Chris wasn't built to beg for attention. He wasn't made to exist in the background of his own life while someone else figured things out. He had loved her deeply, and in some quiet way, he still did. But love, real love, couldn't survive one-sided. It needed reciprocity. It needed effort. And he deserved that, even if Samantha couldn't give it anymore. On his last visit to the house to pick up a few remaining things, Chris walked through the quiet rooms with a strange sense of peace. The pictures on the wall still showed two smiling people. But he didn't feel sadness anymore. He felt gratitude for the good moments, for the years they had shared. And he felt pride for having the strength to walk away not in anger, but in self-respect. As he closed the door behind him one final time, he didn't look back, not out of coldness, but because he was finally ready to look forward. Chris didn't leave in the middle of an argument. There were no bags slammed against the floor, no angry footsteps echoing through the hallway. There was no dramatic outburst or weeping goodbye. When he left, it was quiet, deliberate, peaceful, and that's exactly how he wanted it to be. He had spent weeks trying to untangle his emotions, searching for a moment when everything would make sense. Some cinematic climax that would force both of them to confront what had been broken. But the moment never came. Instead, what grew inside him was a calm certainty that their story had already ended. They were just still standing on the same stage, pretending there were more lines left in the script. Chris waited until a Thursday morning. Samantha had gone out early to meet a friend for breakfast. She hadn't said much as she left, just a clipped, "See you later," like she was headed to another room instead of another life. That was the moment Chris had chosen, not because he was trying to avoid her, but because he wanted to leave with grace. He moved through the house slowly, collecting only the things that belonged to him, or that held meaning he still wanted to carry forward. He didn't take photographs or shared souvenirs. Those belonged to a version of them that no longer existed. He left the framed picture from their weekend in Big Sur right where it was on the hallway table. That memory, once warm, now felt like someone else's life, and Chris no longer needed it to remember who he was. As he packed, he didn't feel the pain he had anticipated. There was sadness, yes, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was the kind of sadness that arrives with clarity, the kind that whispers, "You did everything you could." He wasn't leaving out of bitterness or defeat. He was leaving because staying had become a quiet erosion of his own self-worth. He had spent enough time waiting in limbo. Now it was time to choose motion. Before stepping out for the final time, Chris walked through the house, not as a resident, but as a man paying his last respects. He passed the living room where they used to dance barefoot to old records, the kitchen where he used to make her coffee just the way she liked it, the guest room where their intimacy had gone to die. Each space held echoes, but none of them called him back. He left his keys on the counter. No note, no final message. Chris believed that silence could be its own kind of clarity. Samantha had filled their final months with vagueness, emotional hesitation, and unanswered questions. He didn't want to add to that pile. His exit was simple, respectful, and definitive. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been expressed in the widening distance between them. Out in the driveway, the sky was overcast. A light breeze stirred the air, cool against his skin. Chris placed his duffel bag in the trunk of his car, closed it gently, and stood for a moment, looking up at the windows of the house he once thought they'd grow old in together. It didn't feel like home anymore. It hadn't for a long time. It was just a structure now. 4 walls, a roof, and too many quiet, aching nights embedded in its floorboards. He didn't feel triumphant or liberated. He felt grounded, clear-eyed. For the first time in a long time, his steps were his own. That afternoon, when Samantha returned, the stillness in the house would greet her. She would notice the missing items gradually, a favorite jacket gone from the coat rack, the sound of his boots no longer near the door, the subtle absence of his presence. She would look around and realize he had made his decision without needing a final conversation. There would be no accusations, no guilt-tripping text messages waiting on her phone. Just an empty space where Chris used to be, and the weight of her own choices reflected back at her in the quiet. Chris had always believed that endings didn't need to be explosive to be meaningful. Sometimes walking away, without fanfare, is the loudest statement of all. It says, "I see what this has become, and I respect myself too much to stay where I'm not wanted." In the days that followed, he didn't check his phone compulsively. He didn't reread old messages or wonder what she might be thinking. He didn't post cryptic quotes online or drown himself in distractions. He allowed himself to sit with the silence, not the suffocating silence of emotional distance, but the clean, honest kind that comes after a final breath. He walked through the city differently now, head up, eyes forward. He wasn't rushing toward a new love or running from the past. He was simply existing again, fully present in his own life. Friends noticed the difference. There was lightness in his voice, a steadiness in his posture. He didn't talk much about Samantha, and when he did, it was with a calm detachment that made it clear. He had made peace with his choice. Chris didn't need closure from her. He had given it to himself the moment he chose to leave with dignity, not desperation. He was no longer in waiting. He was in motion. And this quiet exit, graceful, simple, final, was the first real beginning he'd had in a long time. Samantha sat at the edge of the bed, her hands motionless in her lap, eyes fixed on the empty space in the room where Chris's duffel bag used to sit. At first she thought he had simply gone out. Maybe for groceries. Maybe for a long walk to clear his head. But as the minutes turned into hours and the silence in the house remained untouched, a creeping realization began to settle over her. He wasn't coming back. She wandered from room to room, not quite knowing what she was looking for. Maybe a note, maybe a message, or even a trace of frustration. Some kind of emotional residue to latch onto. But there was nothing. Chris had left the same way he had been existing in the relationship for months. Quietly, respectfully, and alone. And now, the silence she once craved had become unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of his voice that gnawed at her. It was the absence of his attention, his presence, his emotional weight that had always grounded her, even when she wasn't sure where she stood. Samantha had asked for time to think, convinced she needed space to understand her feelings. But what she hadn't realized was that clarity doesn't always come with time. It often comes with loss. Now that Chris was gone, she could see everything clearly. She saw how she had mistaken his patience for passivity, how she had pushed him away under the guise of needing to figure herself out, not understanding that her silence was a slow form of emotional abandonment. He had asked nothing of her but honesty. He had stood beside her through confusion, distance, and silence, holding space for her to return. And when she didn't, he left, not with bitterness, but with dignity. In his absence, Samantha heard echoes. The clink of coffee mugs in the morning, the way he used to hum softly while doing dishes, the laughter they used to share over mundane jokes, now replaced by a stillness that stretched endlessly across the walls. She checked her phone several times, hoping for a message, even just a confirmation that he was safe. But Chris had made his decision. He hadn't just left the house. He had left the version of himself that waited for someone who couldn't choose him. She tried calling once. The call rang through, then went to voicemail. She considered leaving a message, maybe something simple like, "Can we talk?" But what would she say? That she missed him? That she had made a mistake? That she didn't know how lonely silence could feel until he stopped filling it? All of those things were true, but none of them could rewind the months he spent fading into the background of her life. Chris, meanwhile, had no desire for vengeance or emotional retribution. He had nothing to prove. He didn't speak ill of Samantha. He didn't block her or post vague quotes on social media. He simply moved forward, not out of coldness but from self-respect. He found peace in the everyday, sunlight streaming through a new apartment window, coffee brewed exactly how he liked it, conversations with friends where he didn't have to guard his heart. He was not rushing to replace Samantha. He was rediscovering the parts of himself he had put on pause while waiting for someone else to catch up emotionally. Samantha, in time, would come to understand what she had lost. Not a man who clung or demanded, but a man who had offered stability, affection, and unwavering presence. She had all the time in the world now, just as she had asked. But with that time came the consequence she never expected. Solitude. And in that endless quiet, one truth echoed louder than any spoken words ever could. Chris had left, not because she stopped loving him, but because she stopped showing it.